Welcome to the second video on the chapter Language Education in Context. Let's start with the concept of bilingualism. Bilingualism is when someone has same degree of proficiency and ability to use two languages. At times, bilinguals are also referred to as double semilinguals, as they might not be equally proficient in both the languages. An individual's proficiency may vary across the four language competencies of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The American linguist Bloomfield defines bilinguals as those who have native-like competence in both languages. However, we have to take into consideration, or we have to accept the fact that the majority of the bilinguals wouldn't be having native-like competency in both the languages they know. We can have a look at the different types of bilinguals. First, balanced bilingual. A balanced bilingual is someone who is expected to have appropriate competence in both the languages. It is an idealized concept and we can't be sure how many of the bilinguals are balanced bilinguals. The second type is semilinguals or double semilinguals. They would be having insufficient competence in both the languages they know. They wouldn't be having perfect knowledge of any one of the languages. They'd be competent in both the languages, but that competence would be insufficient. The third type is compound bilingual. A compound bilingual would be exposed to both the languages they know indiscriminately. Maybe right from their childhood, their parents would be speaking both the languages, and thus they would be having an integrated system for both these languages. There would be a common system of rules in their mind. So they are referred to as compound bilinguals. The next category is the substitute bilinguals. They are the ones who filter their second language thoughts through their first language, or rather we can say that they think in their first language for using second language. So that's who a substitute bilingual is. And to the last category is successive bilingualism or a successive bilingual. It is when we expose children to additional languages. It happens usually with the children who are 3 or more years of age. And when they go to school, they'll be exposed, or they'll have an exposure to new languages. That is when they are getting exposed to additional languages at an early age. So these are the different kinds of bilinguals the text discusses. Now we will see what bilingual method of language learning is. This method is also called PPP method, and it was developed by C.Y. Dodson. This method talks about the stages of presenting a new language to the learners. It consists of 3 parts. First, presentation, practice, and then production. So these are the 3 phases which are there in the structure of this bilingual method. And it is because of this presentation, practice, and production that it is otherwise called PPP method. Let's have a close look at what this presentation, practice, and production means. In the first part of presentation, the teacher presents the learners with a new aspect. The learners would be entirely new to this aspect, and the teacher will present them with a new aspect to this language, new aspect of this language. And that would at first be purely on oral basis. The teacher will make the students to close their books, and then he or she would read the text or read the dialogues to them. This is how this aspect is presented to the learners, and after the presentation they are made to open the text and see the printed version of what has been said by the teacher. So here we can see that the primary stimulus is always in the spoken form. Then to the second part of the three-part structure, practice. The students practice the aspect that was introduced by their teacher, and in this part of the practice there would be the support of the teacher. The students would be having the support of the teacher as they practice the new aspect which had been presented or introduced by their teacher. And moving to the last part, which is production, it is where the students will use the language in context. Now that they have been introduced and they have practiced, they are capable of producing it independently, producing the aspect independently and also in context. In this stage of production, the assistance from the side of the teacher is minimal. I have already mentioned that the spoken sentence would be the primary stimulus to the students, and thus there are less chances of mistakes, like it helps in reducing the degradation of intonation and undue interference from the printed text. I have already said that the teacher would be reading out the dialogue. The primary stimulus would be oral in form. Here I'll clarify it with an example. For the word knife, the spelling is K-N-I-F-E, but in English we know that the K is silent. In German, the speakers, they'd be pronouncing the K. For a German student who is learning English, if the teacher follows this bilingual method, the first input the student or the learner receives is the spoken one. So now they know the pronunciation of K-N-I-F-E is knife and not knife. And after listening to the spoken form, when they open the text, the child or the learner will automatically read the word as knife. And thus the degradation of intonation can be reduced, and also undue interference from the printed text. Again, English, as we know, is an unphonetic language, and it wouldn't be the same as how it looks. The words wouldn't be pronounced the same way as how they look. So a method like bilingual method can help this undue interference, this unwanted interference from the printed text, which may give way to incorrect pronunciation. Another aspect of this bilingual method is the continual feedback from the teacher. This continual feedback ensures proper acquisition of the language by the learner. As I had told, the interaction or the support from the side of the teacher would be reducing as we progress from one stage to another. In the presentation stage, the teacher's support would be the highest. When it comes to practice, the support would be there, and in the production stage, the support would be minimal. The aims of the bilingual method are to make the learner be fluent and accurate in both spoken English and in the written English. It also aims to prepare the learner achieve true bilingualism. True bilingualism in the sense the speaker would be having equal competencies in both the languages. This method allows the use of mother tongue, but that is strictly controlled, and it is used only for the translation of the concept. The focus is, again, as already mentioned in the aims, the focus is to achieve oral or conversational competence and also to make the learner fluent in the language. The texts which are used in the bilingual method or in the execution of the method are usually short and heavily illustrated to support the learner. In this slide, you will get to see a few terms that you should be familiar with. First one is maintenance of bilingual education. This refers to a gradual change from the home language to school language. When a child enters the school, at first it would be the home language that is practiced, and then there would be a gradual change from the home language. Home language refers to the first language of the child, and school language would be L2 or the second language or the medium of instruction that is used in the school. So in the first type, maintenance of bilingual education, there would be a gradual change from home language to school language. In this, some subjects would be taught in home language, whereas some subjects would be taught in school language. The second type is transactional bilingual education. Here, a partial or total use of home language will be there when the child enters the school. But later, this changes or the language changes completely to school language. So L1 will change completely to L2. In the first type, both L1 and L2 would be there. At first, only L1 would be there, and it gradually changes to L1 plus L2. Whereas in transactional, L1 will change to L2. That is, home language will change to school language alone. The third type is additive bilingualism. There is another type, subtractive bilingualism. I'd like to bring a contrast between additive and subtractive bilingualism. In the first type, additive bilingualism, L1 or the first language is maintained and supported. So L1 would be there. The child's first language would be there all throughout. Whereas in the second case, that is subtractive bilingualism, the language of instruction likely to replace L1. So L1 would be replaced with L2. The language of instruction would be L2. The L1 would soon be replaced with or replaced by L2. The next type is immersion program. That is what we practice in the schools in India. If a child comes from a home where only the child's first language is spoken, and the child is getting immersed to a school where or to a context where L2 is being practiced, that is English. The child's L1 could be Tamil or Malayalam or Hindi, whatever. The L2 could be would be English in that context. So a child who speaks only one language enters a school where a second language is the medium of instruction. In most of the schools, the CBSE board or ICSE board, there the medium of instruction would be English. So that is an example of immersion program. Coming to the topic of multilingualism. Multilingualism is when one can use 3 or more languages. In this, we don't expect an equal competency in all the 3 or 4 or 5 languages. Here, it is expected or it is understood that the speaker or the person, the multilingual, can speak and understand one language best. And they can write only one, and they can use each language at different types or each language in different types of situations. Next is code switching. This is a term that we should be familiar with. It is when a speaker changes the languages from one to another. The speaker would be familiar with multiple languages, and he or she would switch from one language to another. Sometimes in between dialogue, sometimes in between a conversation, they suddenly switch from one language to another. If I am a speaker who knows Malayalam, Tamil and English, in between the if the listener who is participating in my conversation, if the listener is equally, or if the listener has knowledge in these three languages, then while I speak, I'd be mixing up these three languages, and that is code switching. Code switching is when the speaker changes one language to another. Usually we see people change the language amidst a dialogue or in the middle of the speech. So that is code switching about. The next one is interlanguage. Interlanguage is a stage in the process of language learning. We know in language learning, you can see L1 would be there, L2 would be there, and interlanguage is the stage in between that. This interlanguage is produced by the second or foreign language learners, and this language is different from the mother tongue and the target language. So obviously many errors would be there. I would be familiar with my first language, and for learning the second language, I'd be getting support from the first language. I'd be looking at the models, the sentence structures in the first language, and I will try to learn the second language with those structures. And the language that is there in between in that process, or interlanguage, is that stage that is between L1 and L2, that happens in the process of acquiring or learning a new language. According to the interlanguage theory, mistakes are an integral part of learning, language learning particularly. Correcting them brings the learner closer to the target language, L2. So L1 is the source language and L2 is the target language. In this method, mistakes are inevitable and a natural part of the learning process. So error tolerance must be there from the teacher's side. They'd be able to accept the errors, and they should understand or identify errors as a natural part of the process. And the learners should also be, they shouldn't be demotivated once there would be a number of errors. They should take the opportunity and correct the mistakes that happen in between their speech. And the next key word that you should be familiar with is multi-competence. Multi-competence refers to the overall knowledge that combines both the first language and the L2 interlanguage. So multi-competence would be a combination of first language and interlanguage. That would be our overall knowledge. You can recollect the chart in the previous slide, and there we know the first two components of first language and interlanguage, and then we have L2 as well, right? So first language and interlanguage, we can collectively call the knowledge as multi-competence. And I have already mentioned that errors are an inevitable part of interlanguage method, and now we can look at the reasons for these errors. First one is empty interference. Empty refers to mother tongue. The rules of L1, the rules and patterns of the first language gets transferred to the target language. We know that the rules or the patterns, sentence patterns of our first language is different from that of English, for example. This will happen with any other language. The rules and patterns would be different. And the second one is overgeneralization. Here I can give an example of the plurals in English. We know that generally, or in a basic case, we can make the plural of a word in English by adding an S. We can take the words like girl, add an S, and we will get girls, which is the plural. Pen, add an S, pens will be the plural. But if we try to apply this rule to every other word, then we'd be making a number of mistakes. For example, we can take the word information. The plural of information would be information itself. Informations is wrong. Same with equipment. Equipments is wrong. Sheep, the plural is sheep itself. Baby, B-A-B-I-E-S is the plural form. Syllabus, syllabi is the plural form. So if we try to generalize the rules to every other things or every other words or sentence structures, then we'd be making mistakes. And the last one is fossilization. Fossilization is the process in which incorrect language becomes a habit and cannot easily be corrected. We'd be having a certain understanding of the first language, and with that we might be learning the second language, and maybe from the beginning of our learning of the second language there would be some mistakes that we would be practicing, and those mistakes would be imprinted in our mind and would have become a habit in us that it would be difficult for us to change that habit. Take an example of many people would be using this mistakenly. Can and able, they'd be using it together, even though they'd be familiar or they know the fact that can and able needn't be used in a single sentence. That idea or that usage is imprinted in their mind or is fossilized in their mind that they can't come out of it so easily. So that is about fossilization. First reason could be mother tongue interference. The patterns of our mother tongue would be transferred to the target language, L2. And overgeneralization, we tend to apply the rules to everything. So that leads to overgeneralization, and that eventually leads to mistakes, then fossilization. So these are the three main reasons behind errors. With this, we have come to the end of this first chapter of the first unit of methods and materials. I hope I was able to give you some idea about the chapter. Thank you for listening.